few years ago, an astronaut, returning from the moon, observed that Earth's most prominent feature was Antarctica. He called it a great white lantern shining out over the bottom of the world. The last 20 years have offered mankind views of his world and insights into it never seen before. But very few of us ever see Antarctica at all. It's too far away, and because we don't see it, we don't often think about it. We have a kind of picture of it, though. We all know that it's very, very cold. And as children, many of us will have had a soft penguin to cuddle, brought to us by Father Christmas from the other snowy end of the earth. But if we once accepted Father Christmas living at the North Pole, our picture of the South Pole is that nobody lives there. Except, of course, the penguins and the seals. For our image is that Antarctica is a cold, bleak and useless place, tucked out of sight and out of mind at the bottom of our world. In the timeless and limitless expanse of Antarctica, man is a very recent arrival. The newcomers are scientists. For the scientists, the unique qualities of the remote continent are an irresistible challenge. They're the kind of challenge that has always driven man to seek out and then to understand those things which lie beyond the boundaries of what is known. But while we didn't come to Antarctica until very recently, we seem to have known of it long before we actually arrived. The story of how we discovered Antarctica is a curious blend of fiction and fact. It's a story of legends and myths slowly superseded by cold facts and often dangerous work. And like so many of man's stories, it starts with the Greeks, for it was their astronomers who gave Antarctica its name. The northern heavens wheeled around the star Polaris, hence the word pole. It was in the constellation called the Bear, or in Greek, Arctos. So they called the North Pole the Arctic, and its opposite, the Antarctic. But the astronomers were geographers too. They worked out that the Earth was round, and since travelers had reported a frigid zone to the north, the map makers reasoned that there must be one to the south as well. Ptolemy of Alexandria labelled his version of it Terra Incognita. It was the start of the legendary unknown southern land. Like so much that the ancients knew or thought about their world, it vanished altogether into the Dark Ages. And we don't find it again until the Renaissance. In the 15th century, scholars and artists rediscovered the classical age. Besides admiring Greek architecture and the exploits of the ancient heroes, Renaissance thinkers began to look at the natural sciences of classical times. Among these new men of ideas was a group of mapmakers, including the great Gerhardus Mercator. He seems to have copied the idea of Antarctica off Ptolemy, but with an interesting difference. For he labelled it, "It is certain land is here, but what its limits and boundaries are is unknown." There would be no certainty for another few hundred years. For the age of exploration that followed was more interested in other places, other ideas. As one unusually honest conquistador wrote, "I sail to serve God, His Majesty, and to give light to those who are in darkness, and to get rich." By the 18th century, voyagers were seeking knowledge as well as empires. Captain James Cook, the British explorer, was one of the first to seek out the facts of the legendary continent. He became the first man to cross the Antarctic Circle. He encountered the pack ice and used it as a source of fresh water. He deduced from its existence that there was a continent further south, but he forecast that if man ever took the trouble to explore it, he would derive no benefit from it. Cook also reported on the wealth of wildlife on the sub-Antarctic islands which he discovered. This drew the next voyagers south, and in one of history's ironies, it was the sealers, who weren't really looking for it, who first dimly saw the mainland of Antarctica. The year was 1819, or was it 1820? For who actually saw it first and when isn't absolutely clear. But it was about then that the various claimants brought to the Antarctic the time-honoured tradition of explorers' graffiti. It was the magnet that attracted the next group south, and they too left their names on what they found. Dumont d'Urville of France was the first to seek the southern magnetic pole. He named not just land, but also some local inhabitants after his wife, Adélie. D'Urville crossed paths with an American expedition led by Charles Wilkes. His name covers a large portion of coastline. And the Englishman, James Clark Ross, the man who had found the North Magnetic Pole, named after himself the ice shelf which barred his way in the south. All three expeditions reported on the bleakness and hostility of what they saw, and for 60 years interest in the newfound continent faded. But there was one portent of things to come. In 1872, a British expedition sailed with the ambitious task of taking an inventory of all marine species. When the Challenger crossed the Antarctic Circle, it collided with an iceberg. The chief scientist on board said later, "We can only anticipate disaster, multiplied 100-fold, should the South Pole ever become a goal of rivalry among nations." He was right. 1910, New Zealand. The leader of the British Antarctic expedition, Robert Falcon Scott, had said in a speech, "The pole must be discovered by an Englishman." Publicly, Scott emphasized that his principal aim was scientific. However, as his party settled in at Cape Evans for the winter, it is clear that Scott was more upset than he cared to show when he heard that a rival was at the Bay of Whales. It was a Norwegian expedition, and it was led by Roald Amundsen. Both men had been to the Antarctic before. 6 years earlier, Scott had got to within 420 miles of the pole, only to be blocked by a chasm. And 5 years before that, Amundsen had wintered over as first mate on a Belgian ship. After that, Amundsen had gone to the Arctic, where he set out to learn polar skills from the Eskimos. Scott, though, had gone on to pursue his normal career as a naval officer. His preparations for the march south would prove to be somewhat amateur. To lay down supply depots, he'd brought some tractors. They broke down within miles of leaving first base. He'd also brought 23 dogs, but nobody really knew how to drive them. Scott pinned most of his hopes on his ponies. If Scott's planning and his goals were muddled, Amundsen's plan was simple. He wanted to get to the pole first. He'd spent his whole life preparing for just such a moment. Amundsen was the first to leave his base. He set off with a polar team of 4 companions and 52 dogs. The years of painfully acquired experience paid off. He covered 1/6 of the 900 miles to the pole in the first 2 weeks. It was about then that Scott set off. Although he didn't know it, he was already some 200 miles behind. The ponies were a disappointment, failing to pull their planned loads. By mid-December, the last one had been shot. Scott and his men had to work harder and harder. The effort began to tell. On December the 13th, Scott noted in his diary, "A most damnably dismal day." The following day, Amundsen and his men reached the pole. It was the supreme irony of polar exploration, for Amundsen's original objective had been the North Pole. But the American, Robert Peary, had beaten him to it. Amundsen had turned south. The regions around the North Pole, well, yes, the North Pole itself, had attracted me since childhood. And here I was at the South Pole. Can anything more topsy-turvy be imagined? Scott, meanwhile, was still man-hauling south, supported through the hardships by the typically British belief that man should reach the pole on foot, to make the conquest more nobly and splendidly done. In spite of all his troubles, Scott made a last-minute change, adding a 5th man for the final dash. It was a decision he would regret. It meant hauling extra food, and in a tent designed for 4, cooking or even drying socks took much longer. On January the 16th, less than 5 weeks after Amundsen had headed for home, Scott's party found his tent under the Norwegian flag, a short distance from the pole. This told us the whole story. The Norwegians have frustrated us and are first at the pole. It is a terrible disappointment, and I am very sorry for my loyal companions. The faces are those of defeat, the pose one of crushing disappointment. All were to die, the last 3 barely 11 miles from a supply depot. Yet Scott's party remain the only men to have reached the pole on foot. But Antarctica had not finished with heroes. With Amundsen's and Scott's achievement of the pole 2 years before, Ernest Shackleton determined to try for the Grand Crossing, right over the continent via the pole. It was Shackleton's 3rd visit. He'd been south with Scott's first expedition, but was frustrated when he was sent home on the grounds of ill health. And then, leading his own party, he'd almost beaten both Scott and Amundsen. He got within 100 miles of the pole, but with food running short, he made the painful but correct decision to turn back. So in 1914, as he forced his ship the Endurance further into the ice, he must have been wondering whether this time Antarctica would allow him the fame he sought so dearly. It did, but not quite as he wanted it. The Endurance became trapped, and nothing anybody could do would get it out again. Shackleton ordered the ship unloaded and an emergency camp made. There followed a truly incredible journey. First, 500 miles of drifting and sledging over the broken pack ice. Then, an 800-mile voyage for help by 3 men in one of the ship's boats. They survive seas which even large, well-found vessels acknowledge as the worst in the world. The destination was a whaling station on South Georgia, but still Shackleton had to cross the high interior on foot to reach it. Shackleton didn't lose a single man. His return with the whole party was even noisier than his send-off. "15 years later, in 1929, the American Richard Byrd would dramatically add the next dimension to Antarctic exploration. Byrd wrote later in his autobiography, "At the time I was learning to fly, the airplane was on the verge of becoming a tool which mankind could fit to his hand. My ambition was to test this tool to the utmost." The aircraft began to labor as it climbed to the plateau. In a bold decision which would have proved fatal if anything had gone wrong, Byrd jettisoned the emergency food. After his return, Byrd would write, "The pole lies at the center of a limitless plain, and that is almost all there is to say about it." It is the effort of getting there that counts. Compared to what had gone before, Byrd's achievement seemed almost effortless. He established the aeroplane as an essential tool of polar exploration. Byrd returned to the pole in 1957, when the Americans were establishing Amundsen Scott Station there by airdrop. The New Zealander Edmund Hillary used more traditional methods. In a development of Scott's earlier experiments, Hillary relied on converted farm tractors. The only modifications were caterpillar tracks and steering and adjustments to the carburetor for the thin air of the high plateau. Hillary's task was to lay down fuel and food depots for a British team driving over from the other side, led by Vivian Fuchs. So Fuchs would be the one to realise Shackleton's dream of over 40 years before, the Grand Crossing. But Hillary, the man who had conquered Everest, became the first man since Scott to reach the pole over land. The meeting of Britain, New Zealand and America at the South Pole marked the end of an era for Antarctica. For this time, after the explorers departed, the pole would not be left as an unmarked spot in the centre of a limitless plain. Rather, Antarctica became home to a succession of scientists who would begin unlocking the secrets of the last continent. Myth gives way to measurement, discovery to documentation. Never again will Antarctica be out of sight, out of mind.